This talk is about the dangers of moral outrage, of fictive narratives about truth and politics, of the meta-narrative of capitalism, which I'll talk about more, and of the hyper-individualism and tribalism we have constructed around our understanding of ourselves and society, but particularly in the United States. But first, as a way to get into the larger topic of dysfunction in American governance, let me address the topic headlined for this talk, and that is, has Donald Trump the constitutional power to take $5 to $8 billion out of the overall military budget to fund the wall? Will he trample on the constitutional authority of Congress if he does so? And if he takes this approach, will he get away with it? The answer to the first two questions is yes. Yes, he likely has the authority to do so, and yes, he will trample on the constitutional authority of Congress. Will he get away with it? Well, we don't know. Why do I conclude this so casually in regard to his ability to do such an extraordinary thing? Well, the reason is evident in American history. I want to mention three presidents and how they have acted in the past. Andrew Jackson, first of all. In the early 19th century, the Cherokee Indian Nation had established a virtually independent state in an area that covered part of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, 53,000 square miles. They had their own legislature, they had their own law force, and by 1827 they had their own constitution, written constitution. Nevertheless, all of the people, white settlers who were bordered on that area, were eager to get a hold of Indian lands. This was a controversy that seemed to be resolved in 1832 with a case called Worcester versus Georgia, in which the Supreme Court under John Marshall, who's the most famous of the Supreme Court justices in American history, and Joseph Story, who should have been one of the most famous ones, both decided that, in fact, all Indian nations were independent nations in the United States, that they could not be dealt with, Georgia or Tennessee or whoever could not deal with them, only the United States government could, and only through treaty, just like any other nation. What happened to this decision by the Supreme Court? It's immediately ignored by the Jackson administration. The apocryphal line that came out of this was, the Supreme Court has made its decision, now let them enforce it. And in fact, they didn't enforce it. They don't have an army or anything of that sort. So Jackson got away with, Jackson really hated Indians. He got away with this. And what resulted, of course, is something you probably know something about, the Trail of Tears, the movement of the Cherokee Nation to Oklahoma. 15,000 people forcibly marched there, 4,000 of whom died on the way. Now, a more popular president is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln did two extraordinary things as president, much more radical than Donald Trump is proposing. First of all, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 1861, the most extraordinary thing you can do in any legal system. And then in January 1st, 1863, he brought forward his Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that slaves in areas under rebellion were free. This had the consequences of freeing any of those slaves who had gotten away already, and it also meant 25,000 to 75,000 slaves who were under the jurisdiction of the Army were freedmen. What did Lincoln base this on? What was his authority to do this? Well, nothing other than an executive order which came under his powers as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. There was no constitutional authority to do this, and it wasn't until the 13th Amendment that slavery was abolished. Finally, there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, as you all remember. I'm sure you're there. Brought forward a huge body of legislation that was immediately declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, every case that came before them was declared unconstitutional. So when FDR became president for a second time in 1936. He had a huge majority, and he came up with a plan, almost on his own, a couple of other people with him, that what they would do is get legislation through Congress which would enable him to pack the court, not just the Supreme Court, but to pack lower courts as well. The way they would do that was they'd take these ancient creatures, that is, anybody on the court who was 70 years of age or older and had been on it for 10 years, and they would add an extra kind of support person on the court to go along with them. The idea, of course, is to water down the conservative majority in all of these courts. Roosevelt never did that because both the Democrats and the Republicans were against it, thought it was a horrific thing to do to the Constitution. In any case, the old Supreme Court changed its mind in its opinion on the New Deal and started to approve a lot of those things. So what are the takeaways from these? Well, one is that if politics and public opinion allow things to happen, presidents will do them. The other one is that the U.S. Constitution creates three bodies, a judicial body, a legislative one, and an executive. And all three of those bodies, through the history of the United States, have claimed to have the authority to define what the Constitution is. The Supreme Court is not the sole definer of that. And so from the get-go, you have a problem with different branches of government claiming the same kind of ultimate authority. Now, I want to look more broadly at the issue of dysfunction now, and I want to turn to a long view, very quickly, and then a view of proximate causes for the dysfunction that we see in American governance today. And there are a lot of elements to be discussed here, and I just can't possibly do them all. First of all, as you already know, the political, social, and cultural differences and divisions among the separate states of the United States is vast. It was from the beginning. In the colonial period, you had Puritan New England, which couldn't have been much different, possibly different in the Western world from the slave South. In New York, you had a feudal system, an actual medieval feudal system in operation at the same time. And in Pennsylvania, you had this plan to bring all of Europe's needy minority religious groups along, even though the Quakers actually in Pennsylvania ruled the province with an iron hand all the way through to the Revolution. Today, of course, it's largely a rural agricultural split with an urban split. But still, the separate states have very distinct identities, and there are very distinct regional differences in the United States that make any kind of national government, the functioning of any national government, really hard. You also know even better the differences among groups of American citizens, racial differences involving whites and African Americans, the Latino interests, Asian Americans, and we also know that there's various tribalisms underneath these different groups. And finally, of course, there's radical religious groups, evangelical Christianity, for example, which combines with some of these elements to create a very difficult scene for a national government to operate. But the most serious problem is the U.S. Constitution, which probably should have been thrown out about 5 years after it was put into existence. The problem is, first of all, the separation of powers. Checks and balances mean that it is nearly impossible to get a bill through Congress, to get a bill approved by the president and approved by all of the courts that encounter it. There's the problem of delegated powers in the Constitution, with the president as commander-in-chief, which has been used in very expansive ways and will be used if he indeed goes ahead with a border wall and isn't distracted by some other issue. The Senate's right to give advice and consent on the president, on presidential appointments and on treaties has also been a problem because the Senate is, after all, was in the beginning and is now the least democratic part of the government. The House of Representatives, of course, was granted the right to initiate revenue bills under the Constitution, but the House of Representatives also was given a 2-year term, which in this day and age means that as soon as you've won your seat in Congress, you'd better start running right now again, which doesn't leave for a lot of time for governance. And then there's the issue of elections and representation under the Constitution. Elections are held by states, not by the federal government. The federal government has intervened at different times. In 1870 with the 15th Amendment, which was supposed to bring the right to vote for all people, including freedmen. The 1920 19th Amendment, which gave the vote to women. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which did finally address the issue of the right of all racial groups to vote. But there are other problems in this. The president is not elected by the people, as you know. He's elected by electors, and every state gets an elector for every member of the House of Representatives and for every senator. Well, all of the states have 2 senators, of course, and that's become an absurdity in this day and age. Wyoming has 580,000 people. Montana has a little over 1 million people. California has just short of 40 million people. This is a difference of population that would not have been anticipated in 1788-89 when the Constitution was brought in. Let me leave it on that. The U.S. Constitution then has become as much a part of the problem of modern governance as it has been a protection for Americans. Most Americans think of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, when they think of the Constitution. Those, of course, were brought in after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, because everybody who ratified the Constitution says we're not having this thing without some substance to it. And so the right to freedom of speech and action and all that kind of thing were brought along in answer to that. Yet, the U.S. Constitution was the only focal point of the United States government going into the 19th century. And through this, the U.S. Constitution became a kind of secular sacred text and is still considered that way. It's something it's verboten to attack, no matter what. And it has become, well, much like the Bible is to some Christians, the Constitution is an unread document, and most people don't know what it contains. And the simplest test given to a broad section of the population would show that I imagine that 10% at most would know what's in it. Okay, another problem in the long view of all of this is that the U.S. Constitution did not address in any way what would be the real engine of American politics and governance, and that's political parties and the partisan press. James Madison wrote in his defense of the U.S. Constitution that the Constitution was written partly to prevent factions from arising that could coalesce and get their way in government, and that having a big republic spread over a large territory would also discourage this business of having factions in control. Well, Madison was almost entirely wrong. Immediately, with the start of the government in 1789, a party, not just a faction, began to coalesce around George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton in the form of the Federalist Party. And within a few years, Thomas Jefferson, who had been appointed Secretary of State, quit, and another party coalesced around him and James Madison and James Monroe. Better put some of these people up here. The Democratic Republican Party had different names over the years. It is today's Democratic Party, essentially, if you follow the lineage. Now, the Federalists, many of the Federalists, except for Hamilton, did not believe they were partisans. They were just impartial. They were the carriers of the God's given truth. So it was hard to attack them in some ways, not in others. The partisan press emerges almost exactly at the same time. John Fenno began publishing the Gazette of the United States in 1789, and he defended all of the Federalist government actions. Benjamin Franklin Bache began the Philadelphia Aurora in 1790, which I published a book on in 1991. And Bache was the leading opposition leader. And in fact, Bache undertook a huge campaign against George Washington. He put out a couple of pamphlets. He had a lot of editorials against Washington, and all of them are pretty accurate in terms of telling the truth and telling the facts. But the fact is that Fenno and Bache were probably more radical in their approaches to partisanship than CNN and Fox News. And they were also much more substantial than CNN and Fox News. So what can we determine regarding this engine of American politics, the partisan press and political parties that don't have any constitutional home? Well, when one party can dominate elections and win the Congress and the presidency, then some things can be implemented. Jackson had the opportunity to bring in a lot of bad legislation. Franklin Roosevelt had the opportunity in the New Deal to bring in regulations of capitalism and bring in Social Security and social nets. When times are prosperous and wealthy, and the wealth is broadly held in the United States, either or both parties can succeed. Now, for example, between 1900 and 1914, both the Republicans and the Democrats were progressives. Both of them tried to outdo each other in reform legislation, and a lot happened in that era. To some degree, you can say that's what happens after World War II as well. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy administrations pretty well accepted New Deal changes and created this sense of some bipartisanship, at least in what went on. However, when the nation is divided in a vastly partisan way and lacks economic equality, then you have vicious divisiveness. And you can see this most clearly in the Gilded Age, Mark Twain's phrase for it, from 1870 to 1890, wherein inequality of wealth combined with corrupt politics to create a truly horrible period. Henry Adams, historian of the period, said one might search the entire list of Congress, the judiciary, and the executive during the 25 years, 1870 to 1895, and find little but damaged reputations. It's pretty well true, and it's not that much different today. Parties quibbled over small issues, the currency and the tariff. I once took a class at 8 o'clock in the morning in the winter semester on the currency and tariff, 1870 to 1895. I just want to make clear that I was very dedicated to my studies. So today we are very much like the Gilded Age, a disastrous blend of growing inequality, racism, nativism, corrupt and vicious politics, ineffective presidents, incompetent presidents, two of the worst presidents in American history in the 21st century, and we're only at 2019. American ethnocentrism, which has gotten worse, and the myth of American exceptionalism, which I think has gotten worse as well. Nobody, when I was a kid, chanted USA, USA to everything that happened in front of them. Now, I would like to talk about some proximate causes for what we have as a crisis today. One of those is capitalism. I don't mean capitalism as it operates in its quiet way. Capitalism as a narrative of life, of the best means for exchanging goods and services. I mean capitalism as it has become what might be called a meta-narrative, beyond narrative, the overarching umbrella over everything, the thing that cannot be challenged no matter what. It is sacrosanct. John Hickenlooper, who of Colorado is running for the presidency, was on Fox News the other day, and the commentator is screaming at him, "Are you a capitalist? Are you a capitalist?" I thought he was going to ask him to get down on his knee and pledge that he had joined the Church of Capitalism, because that's what it is. It became that way, starting with Ronald Reagan and supply-side economics, the idea that you could, by lowering taxes and doing away with regulations, you could have a wider prosperity. To some degree, that's true. This is a debatable issue. But by the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, by the 1990s, this idea of capitalism being superior was enhanced even further. It was even argued, falsely by some people, that democracy was a consequence of capitalism. It did not precede it, but capitalism brought in democracy and therefore held a prior position. Francis Fukuyama, in a book called The End of History in 1992, proclaimed that liberal democracy and capitalism were the victorious end of history. That is the end of big history, of the overarching systems of history. Everything else would just be playing out little events as we went through our lives. The other problem with capitalism, however, is the corporation. The corporations, as you know, have become even more powerful, especially as some regulations have disappeared. People tend to think of corporations as a part of a free market capitalist system, but of course they're not. Corporations rely very heavily upon state support, national support. What we have is state capitalism in the United States. We don't have unfettered capitalism. If we did, Chrysler Corporation would no longer exist, and many banks would have gone under, including many trading houses, as I recall, after the 2008 crash. You only have to have 4 words, too big to fail. Those are the 4 words that show you that capitalism is actually a state capitalism. Now, the people who used that phrase, state capitalism, before tended to be communists and socialists. I think it's always kind of interesting that in regard to capitalism as an ideology, well, no, as a meta-narrative, you have to bow down to its completeness. But if somebody like Bernie Sanders comes along and says we should have universal health care that is socialist, he becomes entirely a socialist as a consequence of that. Well, that isn't the case of how it works. The other big problem in the United States, and it's the problem in Canada too, is that the corporation became a person. This is an odd story, and I don't have time to tell it here. It's a kind of a funny story almost, if you have a weird sense of humor. But the consequence to that has been that corporations get the full protection of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment. They cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And due process of law may not involve just mere legislation. They have acquired the rights of the First Amendment, and of course, as you know, most recently, they acquired the right of, getting behind here, the right to spend what they want on political campaigns. In 2002, John McCain and Russ Feingold brought in an act to reform the funding. What is this doing now? To reform the funding of campaigns, campaign financial reform, which greatly limited corporations and excluded foreign corporations from being involved in American campaigns. It was hailed as a great forward piece of progress. But in 2010, the Supreme Court said, no, corporations have the right under the First Amendment of freedom of speech, and as being persons, they have the right of freedom of speech, and they therefore cannot be restrained in what they spend. So now we're in this hopeless morass of national spending in the United States on campaigns, a problem we don't share in Canada. Finally, another big proximate cause of the problem in the United States is what I will call this distension of the idea of individualism, beginning with do-your-own-thing individualism in the 1960s and 70s, and then being enhanced by the baby boomers who, compared to earlier American generations, had been lavished with attention and advantages as youth. They felt entitled in many ways, including entitled to avoid the draft during Vietnam, to be prosperous, to lead comfortable lives, economic lives, in fact, to lead hedonistic lives. By the 1980s, this biggest demographic group, promoting acquisitiveness, signed on willingly to the greed is good culture of the 1980s. And they meshed nicely with this new idea of meta-narrative idea of capitalism. In fact, I was talking to a friend yesterday in a grocery store, and he said, well, it's really a pathology, and that's what it is. It's a pathology of individualism. It isn't the individualism of right to speak freely and pursue an occupation and all of the things we usually associate it with it. Instead, it has become this sensibility of self alone. In the old days, let's say the old days, the mid-20th century, people would identify themselves by the job they did, the church they went to perhaps, and big elements of that sort. By 2000, if you'll look at people and how they identify themselves, they're as likely to identify themselves by what sports teams they support, what hobbies they pursue, what leisure activities they like to undertake, rather than serious matters of governance or justice or care for the planet.